It's definitely the steno feed. It's definitely the steno feed. It's the steno feed that I usually plug into. It's not, it's got to be shut off. Because I plugged into the press feed, and I'm getting sounds from the press feed.
Which is good or bad?
It's going to work. I don't know if they ever shut off the press feed, if there's ever an instance where
We'll check with the recording studio.
Are they
when he comes.
in, is he coming back?
Yeah, because he's going to help us with the
Okay.
slideshow, so we can ask him. I have no idea what the presentation
If he's
is.
coming back, I mean, it's fine. I can use the press feed, but somebody else might.
Yeah, I'll ask him.
Somebody else that's expecting to use the little 1/4-inch plug, and all of a sudden that plug doesn't work and doesn't have the other, could be stuck.
Good to know. I'll check with him.
Okay.
this off a little bit. Good morning. This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome everyone today to the hearing examining VA's Medical Surgical Prime Vendor, or MSPV program. And before we get started, I want to just take a moment and remember what happened 76 years ago today at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, where 2,403 Americans were killed, 1,178 were wounded during the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. And I had family that, in my family that served there and in Hawaii immediately after that. So it's really was what brought America into World War II. So I just want to take a moment and remember that those lost Americans there. And I'm sure many of you visited the memorial there, and it's really a very moving experience to do that. I'll continue now. Our MSPV is a system of contracts consisting of suppliers and what are called prime vendors that VA has used for over a decade to purchase and distribute medical and surgical supplies in a just-in-time inventory system. The prime vendors handle all logistics in their assigned regions to get supplies to the medical center door. The suppliers provide the items selected by VA to the prime vendors. Many of you may remember our earlier hearing on the issue in September of 2016. At that time, VA was about to launch the MSPV Next Generation, or NG program, whereas the older version of MSPV had never sought to limit the medical and surgical supplies that could be purchased. It never saved very much money either. NG is an aggressive attempt to simplify the supply chain and establish a medical surgical formulary containing a vastly reduced universe of products, initially 6,000, now roughly 10,000. The goal was to leverage VA's buying power with fewer suppliers and items to achieve maximum savings. It was and remains a worthy goal, but the medical surgical formulary represents a huge clinical, cultural, and operational shift. Last September, we expressed our reservations that the formulary and its underlying supplier contracts were far from ready. The timeline seemed like a stretch, clinical involvement seemed tentative and belated at best, and only a handful of competitive contracts were in place. Nonetheless, VA launched MSPV NG last December, and that launch was rocky. The formulary omitted many necessary products and at the same time included more than a few erroneous items. VA recognized this and decided to keep the old MSPV program in place alongside NG through April. Since then, physicians, surgeons, and nurses have been put on teams and tasked to review the formulary, which was created with little clinical input. At one point, a group of clinicians was essentially put in a room for a week to concentrate on the task, but the formulary remains troubled. It seems the early decision to concentrate on every group of medical and surgical supply at one time continues to poison the effort. Meanwhile, a large number of sole source supplier contracts were put in place to launch the formulary. They were intended to be short-term and replaced with competitive contracts. The competitive contracts remain elusive, and VA finds itself continuously awarding new sole source contracts to replace the old ones as they expire. The prices remain high, and the contracting officer's time is consumed by non-productive activities. In the midst of these problems with NG, VA recently unveiled a new concept called MSPV 2.0. It entails outsourcing everything, including developing a formulary for every VAH veterans facility to one all-powerful prime vendor. While I absolutely believe there are many functions the private sector is best suited to perform, the 2.0 model, as it's been described, does not seem to exist in the commercial market. Some things like deciding which medical surgical products it will buy are inherently the responsibility of a healthcare organization. I'm also skeptical that given VA's difficulty in coordinating formulary decisions among all its practitioners, an external company would have a better experience. MSPV has created nervousness and frustration among VA employees and many of the prime vendors and suppliers for years now, but the volume of complaints has lately become overwhelming. At the committee's request, GAO completed a wide-ranging report after reviewing the program for roughly a year, finding continual missteps and difficulties. The Coalition for Government Procurement has also submitted a white paper to VA with recommendations. I hope through our discussion today we can identify a viable path forward and make MSPV work and stop repeating the same mistakes. Whether we call it MSPV Next Generation 2.0 or whatever, it has to make operational sense, work for clinicians, and be timely and safe for veterans. And now I yield to Ranking Member Walls for his opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I concur with much of the chairman's statement. I'd also like to thank him for pointing out today on Pearl Harbor. My favorite great uncle, Morris Ryman, was a fireman in the Navy in Pearl Harbor, and it was a source of pride and family oral history about what he did there, so thank you for that. Some of you have heard me, those who've been here a long time. For the last 11 years, I had a saying that I'm the VA's greatest advocate, but when need be, I'll be their harshest critic. I'll be in the harshest critic mode today. This program was set up for failure from the very beginning due to a lack of commitment and prioritization by senior VA leadership. It appears to be nearly incompetent in how it was done. If I were a conspiracy theorist, I would believe this is an intentional way to undermine the VA to force outsourcing and privatization. It looks that bad. Especially when other hospital systems have been able to do it. VA knew about the best practices and chose to ignore them. And I want to be very clear about that. It appears that the choices were made to ignore what needed to be done. VA's Medical Surgical Prime Vendor Program is clearly worse than it was 2 years ago. I don't know how VA leadership at its highest levels thought an approach to managing this program would be successful. As the chairman said, previous formulary allowed forwarding hundreds of thousands of items off federal supply. Now the formulary contains 10,000 items. That in itself might not be a note of concern, but what the chairman also said was they don't meet the needs of the providers at the medical centers. They weren't asked. This has forced medical centers to buy supplies with purchase cards through emergency contracts at added cost to taxpayers. And this afternoon we'll talk to the secretary about needing more money for the VA. That conversation cannot happen in a vacuum. Clinicians and medical centers know their supply needs. Large hospital systems have done this for decades. When you think about the program this way, it's simple in comparison to acquiring something more complex like an electronic medical record. Think about that. We're going to be asked to spend $16 billion over nearly a decade on the electronic health record modernization program. A project of this size with a requirement like that to be interoperable with other healthcare systems like DoD and community providers has never been done. I certainly support that decision. I've advocated for it for years, but VA's failure to successfully implement the medical supply acquisition programs is simple in comparison to what we're going to be up against. It does not give me a whole lot of confidence that the VA is capable of successfully undertaking that complex acquisition of size and scope. This all points to a leadership failure. VA's contracting and logistics organizations do not have permanent leadership. The MSPV program office lacks a leader. It's only half-staffed. President Trump's hiring freeze prevented an acting director from filling in. I want to be clear. There were years here that every single VA person who sat there was responsible and was grilled on everything that the President of the United States did. We have not taken that mode. We have taken a collaborative mode to getting things done. But I'll have to tell you, that honeymoon is nearly over. The logistics contract program offices do not communicate and coordinate their efforts or work with stakeholders. The program has never had a strategic plan. This program was set up to fail, and I want to hear today why that's not the case. VA has the potential to save at least $150 million if it's done right. VA has enormous buying power it can leverage to negotiate lower prices by buying in bulk. Instead, it has caused more of a burden for providers, contracting and logistics staff, and made it difficult for suppliers to do business with VA. VA could have done this properly by getting buy-in from its doctors, nurses, and clinical staff, the employees who provide care to veterans. Instead, VA cut corners and incorrectly assumed that orders of previous supply purchases met the needs. Medical centers were left in the dark about the formulary rollout, and suppliers chose not to participate because doing business with VA was vastly different from how the medical supply industry does under industry standards. VA had to cancel the rest of the contract solicitations because low supplier participation. VA knows what practices and best practices other hospital systems follow. Instead, it overestimated its ability to successfully implement the program and did not provide the leadership, staffing, and resources needed to make the formulary a success. Without governance, leadership, and buy-in from the stakeholders, VA's programs will continue to fail. I want a commitment today from VA that it will take immediate action to turn this program around. This program needs bold leadership. A lot of work will need to be done to get provider buy-in. The same old way of managing won't work. I would suggest this. How about start small? Find one category of supplies and use it as a beta test through your process to developing the formulary. Involve the providers and medical centers, solicit feedback from suppliers, include other stakeholders, apply lessons learned to the next category of supplies, and work to build the formulary right. This is Project Management 101, and it's also what GAO told you to do. This committee is committed to ensuring VA is capable of providing world-class veterans care to veterans, and we're committing to helping VA get this effort right. And I want to thank the chairman for once again being dogged on this issue, continuing to follow up, and making it clear that anything less than world-class won't be accepted. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Now I'd like to welcome our panel who are seated at the witness table. On our panel, we have Mr. Ricky Lamont, the Acting Chief Procurement and Logistics Officer for the Veterans Health Administration. Welcome. He's accompanied by Mr. Philip Christie, Acting Executive Director of the Office of Acquisition Operations for VA. Welcome. Finally, we have Mr. Roger Waldron, President of the Coalition for Government Procurement. And also we have Ms. Shelby Oakley, Director of Acquisitions and Sourcing Management at GAO. If you would, I'll ask the witnesses to stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to provide is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Mr. Lamont, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Waltz, and members of the committee. Can you hear me? Okay. Good morning, Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Waltz, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss VA's Medical Surgical Prime Vendor Program and the related Government Accountability Office report. I am accompanied by Mr. Philip Christie, Associate Executive Director of the Strategic Acquisition Center. VA is committed to providing our veterans the best care available while being good stewards of taxpayers' dollars. Part of meeting these commitments is making sure that our medical centers have the right supplies and equipment to deliver the care our veterans need. In the mid-1990s, VA eliminated its in-house depot system and converted to a commercially sourced Med-Surg Prime Vendor program to provide medical and surgical supplies. The primary source of supplies for previous generations of MSPV contracts were the federal supply schedules. This approach resulted in our hospitals having access to a clinically viable selection of supplies. But this operational model did not facilitate clinical product decisions on a national level that would allow VHA to leverage its purchasing power. Adoption of clinically driven strategic sourcing is VA's objective under the existing Med-Surg Prime Vendor contract and any future Med-Surg Prime Vendor contracts. The current MSPV contract was conceived in part to leverage VA enterprise-wide purchase volume in order to drive lower prices and improve product quality through the development and use of a national catalog of products. While VA is committed to providing our veterans the best care available, we must do so while also being good stewards of taxpayers' dollars. To achieve this, we must ensure that our medical centers have the right supplies and equipment to deliver the care our veterans need. In 2016, VA announced the award of 4 MSPV contracts. Product prices were primarily established by negotiated blanket purchase agreements against FSS contracts, VA national indefinite delivery contracts, and local contracts to support veterans integrated service networks. VA has decided to move forward with either modifying the current contracts or development of replacement contracts to rectify many of the issues identified by the GAO report. An acquisition plan has not yet been finalized for replacement of MSPV. VA is exploring a different approach to MSPV where potential prime vendors can propose a full catalog of medical and surgical products. This would depart from the current approach where individual contracts are negotiated with each supplier. The potential benefits of MSPV replacement, known as 2.0, would be a more robust catalog of items than we have today and lower prices. Additionally, the administrative resources and time required to negotiate hundreds of individual contracts would be reduced if VA only negotiated with the prime vendors. There have been multiple meetings with industry leaders to obtain feedback regarding this approach to MSPV 2.0, and that feedback is currently being considered. Feedback will also be obtained from VA clinicians before any final decisions are made. This is why our efforts to make the current MSPV contracts more robust are important. We want to make sure the needs of our medical centers are met while we develop a better approach to MSPV. In GAO's recently released report, they made 10 recommendations concerning our current MSPV management processes, and VA has already begun to institute each of them. VA seeks to continue to provide our veterans with the timely care they have earned and deserve. At the same time, we are seeking new and innovative ways to be more responsible stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. We are grateful to GAO for their report and to the committee for their commitment to helping the department improve. I look forward to responding to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Oakley, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Walz, and members of the committee. Thank you for having me here today to discuss VA's implementation of its Medical Surgical Prime Vendor Next Generation program, which I'll call NG. NG is VA's primary means for purchasing the supplies to meet the needs of its 170 medical centers that serve almost 7 million veterans. Some of the goals of NG are to standardize requirements for greater clinical consistency, leverage VA's substantial buying power to achieve cost avoidance, and provide greater efficiency in supply chain management. Effective supply chain management is an essential element of delivering quality care to veterans. Recently, the VAIG found supply management issues at the DC VA Medical Center that posed risks to patient care. Our past work suggests that VA's confusing and outdated procurement framework compounds issues like these and leaves the department without a sound basis for effective and efficient procurement activities to support patient care. As the chairman mentioned, we released a report a few days ago on NG. We found that VA underestimated the significance of the change and lacked an overarching strategy, stable leadership, and the workforce capacity that, if in place, could have facilitated buy-in for the change. These shortcomings, among others, have kept VA from achieving the goals of the program to date. Today, I would discuss 3 topics from that report. First, the challenges that VA faced in setting up NG. Second, the effect these challenges had on the medical center's use of the program. And third, VA's efforts to address shortcomings in its future plans. First, I'd like to point to a graphic that you might have seen in our report. It identifies practices that leading hospital networks follow in managing their supply chains, which have resulted in significant cost savings and improved patient care. These practices include prioritizing categories of supplies based upon the likelihood of cost savings, working closely with medical staff to identify the right supplies to buy, and awarding competitive contracts to achieve the best prices. VA did not follow these same practices when implementing NG. It did not prioritize which categories of supplies to focus on first or work closely enough with medical staff. For example, VA developed its formulary based almost exclusively on flawed data on prior purchases and not on input from medical staff. This flawed approach for determining what items to buy led VA to take actions directly in conflict with the goals of the program and the practices of leading hospitals. For example, VA resorted to non-competitive agreements for 79% of the items on the formulary to meet its December 2016 date to get NG up and running. Given how far VA strayed from leading practices in setting up the formulary, it should come as no surprise that the items on the formulary did not meet the needs of the medical centers or enable the department to leverage its significant buying power. VA has taken some steps to address the shortcomings with the rollout of NG, but continues to struggle with implementation. Specifically, VA included medical staff in its second round of requirements development. However, it relied on just a small group of medical staff to review more than 4,000 products in 1 week's time, representing almost half of the formulary. This approach limited their ability to standardize requirements for the formulary. VA is likely changing its approach to MSPV yet again. It is considering hiring a prime contractor not only to provide distribution services as they do now, but also to develop and manage the formulary. Many details remain unclear with VA's new approach, but it wouldn't be safe for VA to assume that simply changing its approach will solve the challenges it encountered thus far. We recommended several steps that VA could take to overcome some of these challenges, such as developing and communicating a consistent strategy for NG, prioritizing efforts by supply category, involving medical staff every step along the way, and ensuring stable leadership at all levels of the effort. NG could save both money and enhance services to veterans, but only if VA can get the execution right. Until VA takes steps to address some of the challenges we identified in our report, it will continue to struggle with implementation. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Walls, this concludes my remarks. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Ms. Oakley. Mr. Waldron, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Waltz, and committee members, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. The Coalition is a nonprofit association of small, medium, and large business concerns representing more than $145 billion in annual government sales, including more than $12 billion in medical surgical products and pharmaceuticals supporting veterans' health care. Today, my remarks summarize my written testimony, which I ask be included in the record. The Prime Vendor Program serves as the brains of the VA's logistical operations because it touches essentially all critical VA healthcare operations and contractors. It is responsible for developing and communicating the MedSurg formulary and thus serves as the bridge connecting requirements holders, the VISNs, hospitals, and healthcare providers serving veterans, and the VA procurement professionals and contractors. Given this critical role, it is imperative that the Prime Vendor Program Office be led and managed by clinicians. A clinically led program office is a fundamental commercial best practice, and it is our understanding that the Prime Vendor MSPV program is the only medical supply chain in the VA and DoD that currently is not led by either clinicians or medical supply chain experts. This structure has contributed increased inefficiencies and generated medical care concerns. Our members are seeing an incomplete formulary, which causes supply shortages, leaving facilities with no choice but to purchase items on the open market, often at suboptimal prices. Clinical leadership will result in well-defined requirements, thereby avoiding these problems and supporting delivery of best value health care. Without this leadership, many of the challenges of the Prime Vendor Program will continue into the next iteration, with strategies and decisions that too often are driven primarily by acquisition process needs rather than veterans' health care needs. Turning to the next iteration, the MSPV 2.0 essentially envisions outsourcing the program to a single super prime vendor that would determine what the agency buys and how the items sought will be sourced. The super prime vendor would develop the formulary, manage and distribute items, administer subcontracts, and ensure quality control. Nationwide electronic ordering and invoicing would be facilitated using the super prime vendor's e-commerce platform. Coalition members report no comparable commercial model that delivers the extensive scope of management services and MedSurg items contemplated by 2.0. Although our members support improving the Prime Vendor Program, the 2.0 initiative has generated significant confusion. With the needs of more than 9 million veterans in the balance, the Coalition believes that prior to any decision to shift to a new commercially untested platform, the VA should undertake a thoroughly vetted and methodical approach with ongoing evaluations over time to ensure success. We also note that the 2.0 vision would give rise to an inherent business conflict, as one company would be responsible for both developing the formulary and delivering the items listed on it. The Coalition is concerned that this structure risks incentivizing contractor formulary decisions based on vendor financial incentives rather than best interest of patients. Similarly, the current proposal stipulates that cost savings will be a significant objective for the 2.0 program. If this objective translates into low-cost, technically acceptable veterans care, however, it would be inconsistent with the VA's mission, the expectation of our veterans, and the interests of the American people. For this reason, Coalition members also believe that the VA must clearly assert that value, not low price, is the objective when acquiring medical equipment and supplies for our nation's veterans. Finally, we are concerned that by focusing on a single vendor approach, the 2.0 proposal fails to adequately leverage competition necessary to bring innovation to our veterans' health care. Further, 2.0 places no discernible checks on the super prime vendor. Rather, it sees inherently governmental discretion and authority to a private entity. From a program perspective, vesting a single contract with too much authority has negative implications for government and industry regarding market power, the government's ability to replace a non-performing prime vendor, and the ability of the private sector, including service-disabled veteran-owned firms, to either contract with the VA directly or be subcontractors to the super prime vendor. The Coalition believes that there is a path to success here, starting with assuring that the Prime Vendor Program office is led and managed by clinicians, that inherently governmental decisions are not outsourced to a super prime vendor, that conflicts of interest are avoided, and that market competition is levered appropriately to access innovation for veterans. Chairman Rowe and Ranking Member Waltz, thank you again for the opportunity to address the committee, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you all of you all, and for remaining within the 5-minute time frame. I'll try to do the same, and I'll start the questioning. And just throw this open, that large medical centers do this all the time. This is not putting the Voyager 3 up. This is how we as clinicians are able to practice every day. The vendors and the hospital provides the products and tools necessary for us to provide and do our jobs. I'll just, a first question, Mr. Lamont, has the VA had cases, surgical cases, cancel because of a lack of needed equipment?
I'd probably have to take that question for the record. I do believe there's been a very small number, but I would want to research that and get back with you.
That's fair enough. I know we have heard that there have been cases canceled. In my 31 years of practice, I was trying to remember, as you all were testifying, I don't ever remember a case being canceled because I didn't have the supplies I needed to do the case. We knew ahead of time, probably this, unless it's an emergency, and those cases were scheduled a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month ahead. The surgical team went, and the hospital team went right ahead and made sure I had every bit of equipment. I've had the surgical nurses call me and say, Dr. Rowe, do you need this, this, and this before this procedure? And we go over that ahead of time. And that's why clinicians have to be involved in this, because they're the only ones that know when they're in those situations what tools they need. And I don't expect someone else to know that, but I do expect them to ask me so that they can, that you and the supply chain can provide it for me. I think that the other question I have, a second question I have is, who decided, and I'm not necessarily this is bad, but who decided to go with a program that's never been done with an organization that doesn't exist?
Well, that decision has not been made.
So the 2.0 is not, I mean, I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just asking the question.
Yeah, it's a concept that's being explored, but there's not been any decision to go forward with 2.0.
Okay, so during this exploration, what exactly is VA doing to because this is critical for patient care, there's no question, and I know there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes before I show up gowned and gloved in an operating room getting ready to make an incision. So is the system that we've gone to, when we've gone from 500,000 different items on there to 10,000 or so items on there, are the clinicians, the nurses, the providers being given in a timely fashion the tools they need to do their job?
Generally, the answer is yes, but because of the limited formulary, it's not being done nearly as efficiently as it could be. So there's an imperative on the part of our office working with clinicians and the Strategic Acquisition Center to make the formulary more robust.
I know how, and Ms. Oakley, I'm going to ask you this question because my time's running out. Can you explain how the formulary was developed and ultimately who makes the decision about who's on there? That's Ms. Oakley.
Sure. As I understand it, VA began the formulary development effort by running what's called a spend analysis on purchase data, supply purchase data. And documentation that I've seen indicates that this was deemed sufficient to have clinical input because the physicians and clinicians voted with their dollars by making prior purchases. Unfortunately, what wasn't recognized was that this data wasn't the best data to use, and it didn't reflect all the things that the medical centers needed to use on a daily basis. And so that provided the basis of the initial formulary. And then the logistics office began writing requirements based upon that spend analysis with limited input from clinicians. And what resulted was more manufacturer-specific requirements than general requirements that more than one manufacturer could meet.
So this was basically built from the top down, not the bottom
From the
up.
very beginning, the faulty process from the very beginning kind of flowed down throughout all of the subsequent actions that impacted how useful the formulary was.
This would have taken some time, but if I had been building that model, I would have done it just the opposite. I would have gotten that information. But I've gone down to my clinicians and said, what do you need to do your job on the nursing floor and whatever, and then I would have built it up this way, medical center by medical center, and then seen how that data meshed. Would that seem reasonable?
That's in fact what we found when we talked to leading hospital networks, is that the basis of all of their efforts is involving clinicians and including them from the very beginning as a part of the process.
Okay. Thank you. My time's expired, Mr. Waltz.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to associate myself with the chairman's question about have there been delays, affected patient outcomes, canceled medical procedures, or other issues to patient access. So if you take those questions to it, I'd like both of us to be addressed by this. For all the members who are new here, again, this committee, we have addressed this before. And we sat in here, and I listened to the testimony a year and a half, 2 years ago, and the abject failure of President Obama and Secretary McDonald to fix this program, we were going to do something about it. Here we sat. It's right here. Now keep in mind that the suggestion to be made is to allow the private sector to fix it. There is no one in the private sector to do this. So this is our responsibility. These are questions that have been brought up before. This is, as I said in my opening statements, there's an abject failure in leadership to get this right. We are going to get responses back that there were adverse impacts on veterans. So I fully would expect the outrage to be equally strong as it was 2 years ago when we talked about this as it is today. And at this point in time, I think what's different is we're going to look for some answers on how to fix that. So if it's a lack of leadership, how come we don't have anybody in leadership positions in procurement and logistics office, medical surgical prime vendor program office, and more importantly, the chief acquisition officer? How come that's not filled, Mr. Lamont?
Well, the chief acquisition officer, that was filled by Greg Giddens was acting. He just retired at the end of November. With the chief procurement and logistics officer position, I know that leadership is looking at that. I think part of the modernization effort in determining how those functions would be aligned within the department has kept from making a decision to permanently fill that position or recruit it, but it does need to happen. I've been acting for some time. We also are recruiting the program manager for our healthcare team that will oversee prime vendor. That announcement is on the street. We have had prior attempts that were unsuccessful to hire that position. We've also had some hiring freezes that we've dealt with. But
So what exactly does that mean? We're not getting spliced people. We have veterans waiting. Did you just tell me one of the potential reasons is because we have a hiring freeze that does not allow us to fill those positions?
Within our program executive office structure, where those positions that will do this work, we have been impacted by a hiring freeze. at the headquarters level. With those key positions, we have attempted to recruit the healthcare commodities program manager, and that position is now being advertised again.
Well, that's pretty disconcerting, and I would hope there would be a concerted effort from this committee to get to the bottom of that and to address that. It's simply not good enough to say we're going to cut government, freeze positions, and get rid of them. When that initially came out, we had to start backing away from it. Oh, yeah, we'll get the doctors. And then we said, well, what about the emergency room nurses? Oh, yeah, we'll get the emergency room nurses. And then we said, what about the people who wash the sheets? Oh, yeah, we'll take them off the freeze. You fall into that chain, too. Everybody plays a role in this. So this lack of leadership position, I would go back, Ms. Oakley, with my remaining time. You said that this new approach won't solve the problems. We're piloting this. You heard that. It's not on the street yet. Is there a retool to this, or is this the wrong approach in general of what's being described with the prime vendor, the 2.0, or should we retool and go back again, as I think the chairman clearly and I think quite adequately said, we're building it the wrong direction?
I think fundamentally the concept of MSPVNG as it stands now is solid. It was the execution that fell down. So I'm not necessarily convinced that a complete reboot of the approach is necessary, especially given that some of the steps that VA could have taken to better implement the program are, fairly common steps. Include the clinicians, communicate a strategy, make sure everybody understands their role in implementing this change. And I think, just to comment on the leadership, this is a huge shift for VA to an NG program. And when you're talking about leadership vacancies from the CAO on down to the program office, in the height of the transition to this new program, it's no wonder that there wasn't a captain steering the ship at this point and it went a little off course.
Yes. Very well said. I yield back.
I recognize Dr. Dunn for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me start out by saying that I share the outrage that Mr. Walls has expressed. I'm a surgeon. I've worked in a lot of hospitals, a lot of different systems. There are so many errors in judgment in the implementation of this that it takes your breath away. I want to start with the concept. The concept I want to start with is you may delegate authority, but you may not delegate responsibility. Now, that's true in the military. It's also true in business, and it's certainly true in surgery. The surgeon is the captain of the ship. He can authorize people to help him do different things in the operation around the room, but he takes responsibility for it. And that certainly is true in any system of business, and the VA included. So please remember that when we start talking about these super prime vendors and prime vendors, and we're pretending like they are the ones whose responsibility is to make this system work, it's your responsibility to make it work. And they're set up for failure. And they also set up and inveigled to do things that I think were certainly odious and bad behavior, but may be illegal. And I want to ask you specifically about that. It was said that some prime vendors improperly substituted their own products for products that were offered by the contracted suppliers. In this context, does improper mean illegal, or does it just mean odious and wrong and bad behavior? Certainly there's a tort there. Is there a crime? Mr. Waldron, maybe you can answer that best.
That's a tough question. I think it would go back and depend on the nature of the transaction and the agreement between the prime vendor and the hospital and what was actually ordered. If items are substituted for a brand name that was specifically ordered, then that would be an issue, and that would be a problem under that particular contract.
We can't litigate it here, but you get
Right.
the sense this is wrong. I mean, it is very wrong behavior. And to then turn around and suggest that what we need to do is to concentrate all of this power in one of these super prime vendors is an appalling idea. Ms. Oakley has said she thought that the MSPV Next Gen, I guess, is a good idea. It was failed in execution. Do you agree with that, Mr. Waldron?
I do believe that the prime vendor program is foundationally a solid approach. The DHS and DLA are successfully managing prime vendor programs right now. On the pharmaceutical side, the VA has run a very successful prime vendor program. You know, it goes back to execution and it goes back to people. You can't underestimate the importance of people. And the last thing I would just make that's kind of interesting, when I read the GAO report, one thing that struck me that just is the terminology used, for example, to identify the program office responsible for the formulary. It was the Healthcare Commodity Executive Program Office. That term commodity, I think, again, sends a message that these things are all interchangeable, that's like pens and paper.
Yeah, well, we know as clinicians that they aren't interchangeable.
Right.
There's very, very subtle but important differences in many of the different medicines and tools we use. Is the VA capable of implementing another prime vendor program, this one that would work? Your opinion, Mr. Waldron.
They have a long way to go. They need to put in place a clinician-led program office with medical supply chain experts to execute this. That is first and foremost. It boils down to requirements development. If you don't have sound requirements development, you can't support the healthcare providers who are serving our veterans. They need to put people in place. I think the jury's out. Our members have spent the last 2 years trying to execute.
And the
respond.
timeline on this is years. It's always years and years, and veterans are dying and being injured by us in each of those years. I mean, we can't be measuring time in years anymore. I want to ask you one more in the few seconds left of me. We're all familiar with group purchasing organizations. In what way is this very different from a GPO, the MSPV?
In a certain sense, it's similar with their idea of they're trying to leverage their requirements across hospitals and get better pricing and consistency and tiered pricing. So in that sense, it's very similar from my perspective. It goes back to the execution. I think there's a way we do believe there's a way forward. But it starts with putting clinicians in place to manage the formulary.
Thank you for ending it, because my time has expired, ending with the clinicians, though. And please, I beg you, go back and talk to your doctors. You have to do that. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn. Mr. Catano, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lemon, the GAO report highlighted challenges with staffing, and I want to associate myself with Ranking Member Walz's comments about the hiring freeze. As we know, the President Trump's hiring freeze did not exempt acquisition and logistics personnel. And I want to just drill down into how this hiring freeze affected staffing at the medical surgical prime vendor program office, and staffing in the procurement and logistics office, and in key logistics and leadership positions at the facility and network level. What actions, I want to get into this, what actions have been taken to fill the 16 unfilled positions at the MSVP office, program office?
Well, many of the positions we have received exemptions where we can recruit those positions and are working to do that. At the network level, in the field.
How many of those positions have you received waivers to fill from the hiring freeze? Out of the 16?
I'd have to get back.
So you don't know that number, you'll get back to us on that. Thank you. And how many of those positions have been filled of the 16?
I would have to get back with you with.
Okay. So, and we don't, and can you tell me, is there a timeline on when these positions will be filled? Is there a goal? And how many of them would we intend to fill? Well, you don't know how many of these have been exempted, so you really can't answer that answer that, right?
I can't answer it today.
Okay. I want to clarify, did the hiring freeze adversely affect patient care in this particular instance?
You know, having an inefficient supply chain does impact logistics in the hospitals as far as their ability to order the products efficiently. Certainly, they're They do have ways to do purchases outside of MedSurg Prime Vendor, and but I won't say there's not been any negative impact to veteran care, because this does touch veterans' care. But
So at the very least, it really could have significantly affected the veteran patient care of our veterans. Now, I want to expand upon, I appreciate Dr. Dunn's question. I think I wish he hadn't used the acronyms, because I think what he was asking is, can you compare the VA's Pharmacy Prime Lender Program, that's he used the acronym, to its Medical Surgical Prime Vendor Program? So these two programs, one is the vaunted pharmacy program, and we know the VA has the ability to negotiate, unlike Medicare, this huge volume. The VA is able to negotiate with the pharmaceuticals, unlike other government programs, right? So the question was, can we compare? Is there a comparison between the two? Because we're obviously purchasing medical surgical supplies through also a similar situation. Can best practices from the Pharmacy Prime Vendor Program be applied to the MSVP program?
we believe they can, particularly in the area of program management and the developing the requirements area. Pharmaceuticals are different in some respects than med-surg items, but there are certainly lessons that we can learn from our prime vendor program.
Well, is the development of a medical surgical supply formulary potentially more complex? Is it more complex than the pharmacy procurement?
I believe that it is.
Therefore, it would mean that we'd have to have very good managers, very good personnel, and these are the vacancies that I'm alluding to. If it's more complex, even more important to have people staffing the program.
I agree with that.
I'm puzzled as to why it's not been a bigger priority, especially when we talk about surgical supplies and the timeliness of acquiring them, impacting when these surgeries can be scheduled. It would seem to me that this is a kind of an all-hands-on-deck emergency situation, that these positions should be filled, and they should have been filled a long time ago. All right, that's all the questions I have, sir. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. General Bergman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll get to the point very quickly, and I'll keep my questions short. You keep your answers short. How's that? Mr. Lamone, does a strategy document exist over here? Does a strategy document exist for developing the Med-Surg Prime Vendor Program? Does the document exist? Do you have a strategy? Did somebody within the VA develop a strategic plan with a mission statement and the strategy that follows?
There were documents.
Is there a document that exists that you're working from today? Yes or no?
Is there one document that lays out succinct?
Is anybody in charge?
Yes.
Of this over there? Who?
We do have.
Who?
We do have acting people in charge.
If you're acting, you're still in charge.
Right.
Are you in charge?
I am.
Okay. Does a document exist that you use on your desk or reference when you're making sure those under your charge who you are leading and making progress in these programs, that there's a reference document that guides you in your decisions in your leadership role?
We do have a supply chain transformation document that touches multiple areas, but if you're talking about MSP...
We're talking about a specific program here that does not exist because it hasn't been developed. Is there a document?
I'm not going to say there's a specific...
Okay. Well, I would suggest maybe you consider if you're going to be successful in creating one. All right? Now, I'm going to give you an example. By the way, in a former life before Congress, is this uncomfortable? It is, isn't it? It's uncomfortable for me, too. It's uncomfortable for all of us here because there's a lot of veterans in the room who potentially could suffer the consequences of bad decisions at the administrative and deliverables level, okay? We've got great clinicians doing the job. We're not backing them up on the business side of it, not the clinical side. All right, so that's, if you sense a little edge on my part, your sense is good. Let me just give you an example, okay? Because a lot of things are near and dear to my heart, and I just, a couple of weeks ago, was up at Walter Reed for a, procedure that gentlemen and ladies of my age are recommended to get, okay? And it's a little uncomfortable at times. In the medical business, we look for new products. I was in the medical products business for a long time and have dealt with the VA. But for example, there is a product available that is used throughout the industry for colon rectal screening. VA doesn't use it. It makes things simpler. Can you give me an idea for new products without guidelines driven by clinicians and validated through the industry, through others that are already using the products outside the VA system, so any other hospital? Have we created a barrier to introducing quality products that are going to allow our veterans to get better care?
Well, we certainly have to have a more robust involvement with clinicians so they can inform our decisions on what products would be on a formulary and available for ease of purchase in the hospitals. Certainly at the hospital level, there are ways to procure items that any doctor may feel like they would like to have. So I wouldn't say we have a barrier, but we can.
Okay. Do you have a sense of urgency?
We do.
When are we going to see it?
We're developing a plan.
Is anybody in the hierarchy, the wire diagram, and I know my time is running out here, in the wire diagram who's been responsible for developing this new program, has anybody in that, again, wire diagram, been paid a bonus?
I don't know.
I'd like to know. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank General for yielding back. Ms. Custer, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel for being with us today. With my colleague, General Bergman, who is the chair of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, I'm the ranking member. You can imagine that we take this role very seriously. I'm sorry that you're the person in the hot seat today, but I do have to remind you that you're under oath, and these questions are very serious for us. We are here to represent the balance of the well-being of our veterans and the well-being of our taxpayers. And we constantly are faced with this dilemma. But I have to say, join the comments on both sides of the aisle from our colleagues that we swung and missed in a big way on this project. Because not only have we put veterans' care at risk, which is our first and foremost goal, it sounds to me as though we have also cost the taxpayers. And you've talked about these purchase cards that are used. I know for a fact that that's not the most efficient, effective, or frugal way to go about making these decisions. So my concern, and you've had a lot of people ask you if veteran care was compromised. In my view, I want you to include, when you come back with that answer to this committee, veteran care that was delayed was likely compromised, because treatment that is delayed is treatment that may be denied. And I think that's our concern. And you can tell it's not partisan, but this is simply unacceptable. And what I want to focus in on is the impact of the hiring freeze, because this may be the first time that this committee has heard that veterans' care is compromised, the quality of care, the timeliness of care, based on that hiring freeze. So could you just state for the record how the hiring freeze has affected staffing at the MSPV program office, staffing in the procurement and logistics office, and in key logistics and leadership positions at the facility. And once, for the record, could you state, has patient care been compromised due to a hiring freeze?
Well, certainly over the past year, there have been delays in hiring because of the freeze. Certainly, we don't have as an efficient of a supply chain as we need right now, and not having key leadership positions or a more robust staff has impacted that. I do believe that hospitals have ways to get the products they need. We need to make it easier for them to get the products and assure taxpayers are getting good value when those.
And would you agree, and I'm sorry to interrupt, I want to hear the rest of your answer, but would you agree that using these purchase cards is not the most effective, efficient, and frugal way to go about making those purchases?
I completely agree with that. It's really more of a last resort approach. We need a very robust catalog of products that can be efficiently ordered by an ordering officer at a hospital and delivered through the Prime Vendor Program for med-surg supplies.
So, Mr. Lemon, can I ask you, what is the next step for dealing with this hiring freeze? And I would like to work with our committee chair. I'm asking our committee chair to work with the Trump administration. How are we going to guarantee that our veterans receive the highest quality of care in the timely manner that they deserve? And how are we going to solve this? How are we going to get around this hiring freeze to make sure that that gets accomplished?
Well, we do have a process to request waivers, which we've done and we've received.
Would it take legislation for you to, I mean, the waiver doesn't seem to be an effective process here. I'm trying to look at how we can make sure that this procurement is included out or excluded from the hiring freeze. This is important. This is the quality of care that our veterans receive, and it's being compromised. Would that take legislation?
I don't believe so. I believe that those positions can be approved for hire.
My time is up. I would direct that question to the chair if I could for response going forward on how we get around this problem. Thank you.
I'll try to get that response to you by tomorrow. How's that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thanks, young lady. Mr. Banks, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Oakley, the GAO report mentions a, quote, lack of leadership stability, end quote, at the VHA program office, but no mention of what actual qualifications VHA leaders need to possess in order to be able to effectively lead a medical surgical program office. So what is your vision on the qualifications and experience for the MSPV director that was recommended in the report?
I think you need someone that has both clinical experience as well as acquisition and procurement experience. One of the things that we found during the course of our review is, this effort requires collaboration across a number of different types of office, procurement, logistics, clinicians, and they all speak different languages. So getting somebody in there that has experience on both sides that would be able to bridge that gap and translate would be an ideal person to put in place. But frankly, at the very minimum, getting somebody in there for the long term, getting somebody who's going to be there and be able to establish relationships all across VA to be able to implement this big change is what should be the priority.
Okay, that's very helpful. Now, Mr. Lehman, now that I gave you a break, back to you for a moment. It was brought to our attention at a recent roundtable that you participated in that the department was in the final stages of determining a, quote, way forward, as you called it, to address the backlog by implementing business process reforms in Section 8123 of Title 38 through administrative means via a rulemaking. Can you provide us with a more specific update of the status of this effort and a better understanding why the potential exists for a rulemaking? It would seem that you already have the authority for this, and it would be likely be better if this was done administratively. So what is the timing for such a decision, and when do you think it would be implemented if we have to do it administratively? If it has to be done via rulemaking, as you said, what authority do you need from the committee to do that?
Okay, the question you posed is in regards to prosthetic implants, which is covered by the special authority VA has under 8123. A business process has been drafted. It's being circulated amongst the department for concurrence. At that time, once that's finalized, our Office of General Counsel will determine whether we can implement administratively or go through rulemaking. And that decision has not been made yet, but we anticipate that will happen quickly. Probably within the next 30 to 60 days, we'll have a decision on that.
Okay, we'll follow up with you in the next 30 to 60 days. On another note, how is the new process for purchasing the surgical implants different from the existing prosthetics and sensory aid services process?
Well, the proposed process really essentially relies on having national contracts where we've leveraged our spend, but the contracts are with the major suppliers. The portion where we have to depend on the authority in 8123 is really the timing of the orders, because a physician would actually choose exactly what they're going to use in the surgery. We would issue those orders after the products are consumed, and that's where we need the authority that's outside of the FAR.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Oakley, since I have a minute left, the GAO report stated that the recent reforms did not meet the need of medical centers and thus the end user in caring for the patient. It would seem that for the arrows in determining the formulary items are more likely not points up from the clinical needs perspective and instead down to the physician or surgeon. Do you see any of this, if that makes sense, do you see any of this changing in the 2.0 effort?
I think that VA has come to the recognition that having a clinically driven program is vital to success. I think it was a late recognition, and I think that they are, at least on paper and what I've seen, indicating that this would be the way forward. And so I find that as a positive development. Again, though, it all comes back to execution.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Mr. Kaufman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, can you, Mr. Lemon, can you tell me, Miss Stella Fiotis, what position does she have right now?
I believe that she is the acting Chief Acquisition Officer after Greg Giddens retired.
So she's in charge right now, temporarily, until a decision can be made. Because that's interesting, because she was in charge, she was one of those in charge of the, she was the Office of Construction Projects, Office of, yep. And so under the Office of Acquisition, Logistics, and Construction. And so we had a project in the state of Colorado that she was in a leadership position on that was supposed to cost $600 million, a little over $600 million, cost $1.67 billion is where we are right now because it was so badly mismanaged. And yet she's been promoted in terms of the hierarchy at the VA. And so you can guess why there's not a change. This administration made so many promises about how they were going to clean up the VA, but if they're keeping people like this around, they're obviously not that interested in cleaning up the VA. So one of the problems that we had before when we had a briefing, I think it was probably a couple years ago, on procurement, a year or 2 years ago, last September, was that they were, Mrs. Oakley, maybe this is to you, they were taking the purchase cards to get around the contracting process and just adding them all up. But part of the problem is that patient safety was compromised because they were able to get around all the procurement rules with some of those regarding patient safety, particularly in the purchase of tissues and things like that, human tissues. And so could you comment on that? Or
I can't directly comment on patient safety, but I would say that purchase cards were definitely seen as the way to meet the needs of the medical centers because of the limited formulary and the formulary that didn't meet their needs. And so VA has seen an increase in purchase card purchases, during the course of the past year with the rollout of MSPVNG.
okay, anybody else? Mr. Lemon?
Certainly the greater use of purchase cards has not been good for VHA.
Well, how can you, so we've known this problem for so long. We've identified it that people are using it to get around procurement rules, get around contracting rules because that's much more involved and they want to take a shortcut. And that's not good for the taxpayers, and that's not good for the VA patients. Yeah, you continue to do it. I mean, your organization continues to do that. Can you tell me why?
Well, the reason they're doing it at the field is because we haven't provided a robust enough prime vendor program for med-surg supplies to meet their needs, quite frankly, and that's what has to be corrected to reduce the purchase card spend.
Okay, well, I can say I'm very disappointed. I don't see changes from the last administration to this administration in the VA, and that's very disappointing. I yield back.
Dr. Winstrup, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Rowe. Mr. Lemon, who is the MSPV program leader at this time?
Currently, we have Dan Harris, and he is supported by John Miller in our office.
Can I ask what their qualifications are? Do they have any clinical backgrounds, RN, MD, where they fit in that?
They have logistics background. They are not doctors or nurses.
Mm-hmm. So who at VHA is the clinical leader overall?
My boss is Tammy Zarnacki, and she's certainly involved in the program, Assistant Deputy Undersecretary for Health for Operations and Management, and she has a nursing background.
Okay. VHA has said they plan to utilize about 130 clinical program offices to provide clinical input going forward, which makes sense. Can you tell me how this will work and give me some specifics?
We've developed a very structured, clinically driven sourcing program that's being routed for concurrence at this juncture, but it does involve the program leaders and clinical leaders, and they would identify those clinicians in the field and actually take responsibility for the product areas that falls under their responsibility. It's recognized, I think, across VHA how important having a very robust and in-depth clinical program is to support our med-surg program, and that's what we're trying to build. One of the weaknesses or failures in our prior attempt at this is that we didn't have the structure behind it that we needed, so it was always a challenge to get the clinicians and get the input. and it's been recognized within the department to fix this. We have to have a very structured, clinically driven sourcing program where these department heads fully understand their responsibilities and obtain the services of the clinical experts in the field to bring to bear to the decisions on our formulary.
Yeah, I'm just curious how far down the line you go. If you have one person who's in a certain field and maybe they have some input, that may be fine. And I realize how big the VA is. But I can tell you at every hospital I worked, every year when it comes to budgeting and planning and everything else, every individual surgeon would get asked, is there anything that you need? Is there something new out there that you need to do your job better? How far down do you take this? I know, Ms. Oakley, you talked about execution, right? How are we executing this? And this pertains a lot to the retention of those that we're trying to recruit, because if you come in and you want to take care of veterans, but your hands are tied because you can't get the things you need to take care of them the best way that you know how, and they say, well, that's the system, or we can't do that, guess what? You leave, because your name's on the line. And that doesn't mean you get everything you want whenever you ask for it. You know, you can, but you have to have a process all the way down to each and every individual, in my opinion. And so I'd like some comment on that and maybe some advice from Ms. Oakley as well.
Well, I completely agree with you, and that's why at the hospitals we have clinical product review committees that can actually push requirements up in addition to trying to establish this clinically driven source.
So that's at a committee level, but I'm asking, are you getting down to the nitty-gritty, to those that are actually doing the work currently?
We definitely need to do a better job of that.
Thank you.
There's
Ms. Oakley?
That was one of the things that we found in our review is that VA didn't really outline a process for how to get something onto the formulary that would meet the needs of a physician-identified need. And so one of the things we recommended, because the formulary is a living, breathing thing, right? I mean, it's going to be changing all the time, is laying out how does one working level physician go about getting something on the formulary so that they can actually have the things that they need in their day-to-day life. And so that's right in line with one of our recommendations in saying that they should lay out this process and communicate it through all levels of VA.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Pollock, when you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I appreciate that. I'm a little taken aback here. Be very blunt with you, so let me just get right to it. You folks over at the VA have about 170 veterans medical centers around the country, right? Is that right, Mr. Lemon? Okay, about 170, about 40,000 doctors, practitioners, and 170 medical centers around the country. And you're taking care of about 7,000 of our veterans who stood up for this country and fought for our country and gave us our freedom. Is that right? Okay. Now, you would think with that kind of horsepower, you folks would be able to get your act together, use the volume that you folks represent, and go out to these different folks that manufacture catheters and stethoscopes and scalpels and buy this stuff in volume, such that the folks up at Togus, Maine, when they need to operate on one of our heroes, they'll have the stuff that they need. And now we're hearing from Mr. Bergman a minute ago, you said you don't even have a plan to execute this process. Number two, I just heard a minute ago that because you folks are unable to get the equipment that we need in our operating rooms, what have you, you folks are using credit cards or some sort of government credit card to get what you need before they go in the OR and take care of one of our veterans. And you know what I think? I think you've had 12 years to do this. Last time I asked my staffer, she said, yeah, this process started in 1995. This is 2017 on December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. It's almost 2018. This is the third time you guys have been tried to do this. You know, I don't know. Neil and I are new here, along with Jody and Clay and Jim and Jack and Jim. I'll tell you, if I'm here 12 years from now, I don't want to hear you folks come in and say, well, this is our sixth time trying this. We can't quite get it right. I don't think you guys are competent. You have 345,000 employees. Your budget's gone from $120 billion a year to $190 billion a year over 8 years. You got plenty of dough, plenty of people, and you're saying you can't find the people to run this. Give me one day, I'll go over there, I'll find you someone to run this. So I don't want to be around for the next few years having you folks come back in saying, well, we couldn't quite get it right. Mrs. Oakley, you're involved in the part of government that's supposed to oversee these folks and analyze if they can do it, right? Okay. Have you ever heard of this outfit over the DOD called the Defense Logistics Agency?
I have.
Okay, good. And they have a similar process, right? They're trying to do what you guys are trying to do, which is to buy in bulk to make sure the folks that are providing health care for our heroes can do it cheaply and save the taxpayers money, right? How are they doing?
As far as I know, the DLA has a fairly successful program.
Good. How are we doing over at the VA? Poorly, right?
Yes.
Good. I'm trying to save you some breath here. You saved any money, Mr. Lemon, over the last 12 years trying to do this? You saved any money?
Well, we have saved.
How much have you saved?
Under the supply chain initiatives, it was approximately $300 million.
What percent have you saved?
What
percent have you saved? If you're buying a scalpel, you're buying 1,000 of them instead of 2 of them on a credit card, you'd think you'd be able to save a little bit of money.
You would. I don't know what.
Okay, fine. For the record, I have a couple questions for Mr. Lemon. Number one, you talk about distribution and pricing agreements. They're different from contracts, right?
They are.
Are the prices binding in a distribution and pricing agreement? Yes or no?
I don't believe they are.
Okay, so that's a no?
No.
That's a no. Okay, thank you. Mr. Lemon, is there any competition when you're dealing with a distribution and pricing agreement?
Not normal.
No, okay, so it's sole source, right? Okay. Let's see. How about any conflicts of interest? Ms. Oakley, have you seen any potential conflicts of interest? These folks have been trying to do this for 12 years. Now they have the third try. They're coming back to us. They're trying to do this. Any potential conflicts of interest and what they're trying to do, which I have no confidence they're going to be able to do?
I didn't see any apparent conflicts of interest in our work.
Good. Mr. Chairman, I have 30 seconds. I hate to do this, but I'm going to yield back the 30 seconds so I can give Mr. Lemon a break here. Thank
I
you.
may have the big one here that Mr. Holcomb yielded back some time. That's amazing. Thank you, sir. Mr. Arrington, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think there's enough outrage on this committee, quite frankly, with what we hear day in and day out. The last oversight committee that I sat under the leadership of Chairman Bergman was about a GAO report that basically said that the VHA is not investigating bad doctors, they're not disciplining bad doctors, and they're not reporting bad doctors to a database so that those bad doctors can't continue to practice in the VHA and in other places, and it was just astonishing. And so I want to associate myself with the indignation of Chairman Walz, Ranking Member Walz, and of my colleague Bruce Poliquin. I don't even know where to begin. I think I'd first say, for the record, thank God our veterans have a choice now, and we can't do enough, Mr. Chairman, to give them more choice and flexibility to get out of this broken, government-run, single-payer healthcare system that they're trapped in, and it's shameful that we do that. And so we need to do everything we can to continue to enhance that choice program. Ms. Oakley, I appreciate your clarity and your definitiveness in your answers. You seem very confident, so I'm going to start with you. And I appreciate that. That's sincere. You said there's an execution problem, that the model is a good model, but that we're not executing. Is that because there's not enough staff, there's not the right staff, there's not continuity in staff? Is it leadership? Is it poor planning? Break that down for me, if you would.
Okay. Well, the short answer is it's all of the above.
Okay.
I think any...
Rank order the top 2 or 3 for me.
Well, if you look at organizational transformation leading practices, the bottom line is it all starts with solid leadership and tone from the top.
Can I stop you just right there? Because It's my understanding we invited some of the medical leadership from the VHA to come and testify today. Are you aware of that?
I am not.
Mr. Lamont, are you aware of that?
I heard that earlier today.
Yeah, we asked your bosses to come, and they decided to send you all. And it tells me that there is a leadership problem. They ought to be here. I can't think of anything more important to veteran patient care than what you're doing, and they refuse to come. I don't know the reason. Maybe there's a good reason. But so leadership, tell me the chain of command. Give me the 3 or 4 layers up. Start with the top and work your way to yourself.
It's actually complicated within VA, right?
Well, there's problem number 1.
Yeah, which we've reported on before within the organization. And so, the chief acquisition officer is a key role in all of this. It's the person that's advising the Secretary of VA on how to accomplish VA's mission through its acquisition management function. And it's been somebody in an acting position and has turned over multiple times since at least 2009.
So I've heard a lot about hiring freezes from my colleagues today. Were there vacancy problems before the hiring freeze?
There were.
So so the continuity in leadership existed or pre-existed this hiring freeze?
Yeah, absolutely.
And by the way, I'm for hiring freezes. I'm for cutting this government. I think you could cut a third of it and we could continue to provide. It's about cutting the right parts of it and being smart and strategic about it. And I'm willing to work with the ranking member and anyone else to send a letter to the leadership, whether it's the secretary or if it's Miss Clancy or Charnecki, and express our serious concern that they aren't here at this hearing to explain why this program is not working for our veterans, and to tell them that they need to get in gear in hiring people and getting their operation fully functioning. But that's something that I'd be willing to do, Mr. Ranking Member, and anyone else. But again, this seems to this continuity or lack thereof seems to pre-exist this hiring freeze.
Absolutely.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, and at all levels, from the CAO on down to key logistics positions within the medical centers. They're not easy positions to fill, so it's not necessarily, that you would be able to hire somebody off the street, and competition from private hospitals, as I understand it, is pretty fierce for skilled, experienced logistics individuals, as well as the acquisition workforce related to contracting skills. So these kind of vacancies and lack of skill sets are pervasive throughout VA and also other agencies.
Thank you, Ms. Oakley. My time's expired. I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman, for yielding. Mr. Peters, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, we co-hosted a roundtable with Mr. Banks, which brought together the VA and stakeholders from the medical device community who could participate in the program to discuss what's occurring, what we could do to make it better, and appreciate the chairman having the hearing today. We also had the GAO and Coalition for Government Procurement in attendance. We also had the chairman and very interested in continuing to work to improve this program. At this time, though, I've not been able to attend most of the hearing. I'm going to yield my remaining time to the ranking member, Mr. Walz.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. And I'd just like to say, and I appreciate the gentleman's willingness to work together on this. I would like to say, though, using a fully functional VA is a choice. It's a choice that 94% of VFW members who were surveyed would like to make. So, as I said in my opening statements, should I be a conspiracy theorist on this, continuing to undermine the VA's capacity to do what it's going to do under the guise of then you will have to go to the private sector is not providing a full range of choices. Those of us who used VA services and find it quite adequate are very frustrated when the reason we're not getting that care is because we haven't filled the positions. I don't disagree that this may be extended before, but I want to be very clear. Under oath, a VA person said, the hiring freeze has precluded us from filling these positions and it's adversely affect veterans' care. That should sink into all of us that we do have a responsibility to get that together. We do have a responsibility to find this. And I'd like to say, Mr. Lamont, I think the questions were right about asking other folks to attend here because the buck does stop somewhere. And again, for years I heard it. It stops with the president and it stops with the secretary. I want to be thankful for you, your honesty and candor, and I also want to make it clear in a public setting, should there be any retaliation for stating factually what you see, that will pay with a heavy price in this committee. This idea of making sure VA employees are able to come up here, speak candidly about what's going to improve our veterans care, I'm appreciative of that. I know you're taking a lot of this. It's system-wide. GAO is here to help us do that. There's certainly things out there. There aren't necessarily, as we heard, if you send this over to the private sector, who's going to do it? Who can do it? And as the chairman and I were talking about here, the Defense Logistics Agency might not be the best example of how everything's supposed to work, and the F-35 certainly comes to mind, and other things, that these are complex issues trying to get care. But if we're looking for the easy fix, or we're looking to pass the buck on this, that is simply unacceptable. I'm with, the chairman said it right, we're not trying to launch Voyager 3 here. We're trying to order surgical supplies that they have. The suggestions made, and this is why this committee is so strong. These physicians speak with experience. They speak with let them into that. GAO put out a chart we have been up here referencing and looking at that said, follow this and you'll get this right. And so I thank the gentleman for yielding his time. I want to be clear that I am a supporter of choice. I was there when choice was created as part of that, as was Mr. Takano and Mr. Rowe. But part of the choice is a fully functional, and again, if it's hyperbole that it's a government, no, it's our responsibility. And if we've said this, you give them that card and tell them to go somewhere, what hearing are we going to have with hospital executives from the private sector who get to do it the way they want to? These are the only people that we can capture, bring in here, swear under oath, and get some results. This should not be that difficult. This is not the fight of privatization, choice, community-based care, whatever. This is basic logistics of functioning of a medical institution that is being accomplished. I represent the Mayo Clinic. They have to order a lot of supplies for their institutions across here, and they're able to do that. So I have full confidence we can do this. We just need to, again, I have come full circle and been back here from that 11 years ago starting, and I have been convinced of this. Almost every single problem can be fixed by proper leadership, by accountability and what's there. And this is no different. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. There are many private sector systems. HCA comes to mind. It's a large system about the size of the VA as far as number of hospitals, and they don't have these problems. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, this hearing is reflective of exactly the type of exasperation that we the people, we just don't get it. So we shake our head. Any attempted savings for money to be from bulk purchasing is certainly wasted on bureaucracy. I don't have confidence in this entire MSPV system. The VA operates, I believe, 1,233 medical facilities, including hospitals and CBOCs. We're spending $1 billion a year. That'd be about $4 million per facility. There are distinguished doctors and surgeons on this panel. I've had my surgeries based upon traumatic injury, including my entire right eye socket to be reassembled. And I just presumed that the surgeons and doctors and surgical staff had the tools and the facilities that they needed in order to perform that surgery. And I would expect that, that we can do a better job by allowing the money to follow the veteran. I think that the money we're spending on this program is wasted. We already have oversight over the command and control and chain of command over every VA facility and the directors thereof. I think the doctors and surgeons and medical professionals that work within the VA and the VHA should be able to order what they feel they need. And I think that the members of this panel that are testifying today are quite courageous to have appeared, you know, because it's virtually indefensible.
the waste of the people's treasure to accomplish nothing. I represent the LHC group in Louisiana. They operate in 26 states. They have 13,000 employees and 60 hospitals. They don't have this problem. But they don't have the bureaucracy that we deal with in this town. With the chairman's permission, I'd like to yield my remaining time to my friend and colleague, Dr. Dunn, an accomplished surgeon.
Gentleman, yes, Dr. Dunn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Congressman Higgins. I'm a bit of a supply side kind of guy. I want to turn to the suppliers. There's a great sense of dissatisfaction among the suppliers to this program, and I want to ask Mr. Waldron if you would characterize that dissatisfaction briefly.
And so our members are have been frustrated with the rollout of the prime vendor next generation. We have seen, RFPs and solicitations that have not accurately described products that to be acquired.
We have information that some of them are actually considering just not dealing with the VA. It's just not worth their trouble. Is that accurate?
I think there is bid fatigue out there right now because we've had a cycle, sort of speak, where solicitations were put out, then they were canceled. Now the VA is attempting to put them back out again. And all this bid and proposal costs are part of the business when you're dealing with the government, and those funds are not unlimited for a private entity.
So these are businesses, I just want to underscore this for everybody, these are businesses that literally exist to make and sell products, and the VA is making it so painful to do business with them that they will walk away from the business. That really is just a huge statement against the process that they're facing with. One more question I want to bring up, because this one also is a little frightening from a clinician's point of view, and that's the gray market items that we see. These are really dangerous for patients because a lot of the things that we use have to be handled very carefully, very sterilely. And I see that the gray market has somehow entered into the VA purchasing system. Can anybody make sense out of that for me? Tell me how that happens, or that it won't happen anymore. Give me some comfort. Gray market items being bought by our government. Mr. Lemon.
I've heard of a few examples of that. I don't think we generally have that problem on any scale. But again, I think it goes back to our supply chain system. When we don't have the breadth of products we should have available that's on national contract with reputable manufacturers.
My time has expired, but I'd like you to assure us. In fact, I'm going to ask you to get back to our committee. Send something back that says, what are you doing to address this problem so that it doesn't continue to be a problem? Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman for yielding, and thank the witnesses today for being here and sharing your testimony on this. It's been a difficult hearing today, and I will see if Mr. Walls has any closing comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here and helping. In lieu of a closing statement, I'd like to yield 30 seconds to Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Ranking Member Walls. I just want to make sure that we don't rush to the conclusion or make the wrong conclusion from today's testimony that the answer is to put everyone into the private sector, or that the choice program is somehow going to alleviate what's going on here. What I heard today was we have a lot of unfilled positions. And those positions have been vacant and possibly attributed to an unwise hiring freeze. Second, I was also at that oversight hearing, and my line of questioning focused on whether or not private sector health organizations were just as guilty or just as lax in terms of their reporting of bad practitioners. And the questioners were either unable to answer that question or were actually saying that they probably weren't any better than the VA. So the answer is not necessarily that the private sector health medicine is a panacea or an answer to the challenges we have at the VA. And I would say that that we have to do our best to make sure that the positions we have at the VA are filled, that we staff the 40 to 45,000 unfilled positions in the health arena here at the VA. That these are some of the things that we need to focus on just as much, rather than rush to the conclusion that people are trapped, so-called trapped in this system, rather than making the VA the very best VA that it can be.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. I will point out that in my 9 years finishing up this month on the VA, I looked at the first budget that I showed up on in 2009 was $93.5 billion and about 250,000 employees. And now the VA has a budget that we're trying to work to. It's $186.5 billion. And I do want to point out to people that because of the Budget Control Act in 2011, essentially, until we changed the caps this year, those numbers were almost level. So we got that money from the military, from education, from other programs, and put it in the VA because this Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, felt that was important. And I think when it's not being spent wisely, it's frustrating to us here and to those other people that we took the money from. Basically, that's what we did. And just to make it very clear, it is not a money problem. It is not a hiring freeze that's doing this. I can tell you right now it's not. It's leadership, and that's absolutely what it is. And so when you have good leaders in places, I got a letter that I wish I had time to read on here from a veteran in Albuquerque, New Mexico, that 6 years ago wouldn't go to the VA there and he walked through every bit of his visit. And then he wrote me a letter. I called the guy yesterday. He wrote me a letter about how much better it is. So he walked me through his next visit, which was absolutely a great visit to the healthcare. So things are not all doom and gloom. I want to make sure that's out there. There's a lot of good things going on in the VA. Right now, this is not one of them, though, I'll have to say. And it's got to get corrected because Mr. Takano, in my career, I don't remember having to go out and walk and tell a patient's family, I don't have the equipment and tools to do the operation on your wife today. That never happened. I've worked in VA hospitals. I've worked in private, non-for-profit hospitals. I've worked in for-profits. I've worked the whole gamut. It's never happened to me before, but it is happening in VA because of this procurement problem. And as Ms. Custer said, this ultimately will affect quality of care. Putting a hernia off for a day or a week, that doesn't matter. Putting a bypass off for a stent or something, that really matters, or a cancer operation might really matter. And I know our witnesses today, many of you in the audience also, none of MSPB trials and travails are written. This is not new news to you, but you work with the program every day, and I get the impression that when many of the decisions that we've discussed were made causing problems that we're still grappling with today, some of you probably felt that they were questionable. For example, setting a 6,000 item formulary when the industry standard is 30 to 50,000 items, trying to establish the formulary all at once in a little more than a year, initially either not insisting on clinical leadership involvement or deliberately sidelining them. You're professionals, and I believe these decisions must have made you uneasy. I ask that you use this GAO report and this hearing as catalyst to take a hard look at the situation and decide what really makes sense. What kind of MSPB program, and whatever you want to call it, I don't care, are truly prepared to live with for years in the future. This is critically important, providing quality health care for people. What is best for our veterans? Unfortunately, it seems the desire to gloss over difficulties and declare victory and move on may have contributed to MSPB's problems in the past. If it takes longer to get it right, so be it, get it right. I appreciate your participation today, and I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material without objection so ordered. I do, before I finish, want to thank the committee, both sides of the aisle, for a very, very productive year from this committee and what we've accomplished for our nation's veterans. Many times we don't, the Accountability and Whistleblower Act, the Choice Act we've done, the Forever GI Bill, the Claims Appeal, and we're going to continue. This committee is going to continue to work to try to get things right and provide, as Mr. Takano said, the best quality care for our nation's heroes. And I, again, want to wish everyone here in the audience and on this committee a very, very Merry Christmas with your family and a happy holiday season for all of you.
Mr. Chairman, as a point of personal privilege, I just want to acknowledge that our colleague, Ms. Brownlee, is not with us today because she's in her home district because of the fires in California. And I appreciate your holiday wishes, and I take them to heart. And I too, enjoyed this year of productivity.
Thank you all very much, and with nothing further, the meeting is adjourned.